Welcome to Cribwolf Talks. From time to time, we dive into stories where they transcend their time and continue to raise questions, challenge perspectives, and offer valuable lessons to today's world. Whether it is historical events, cultural narratives, or modern-day developments, we revisit these stories to explore their relevance and how they shape our understanding of the world around us. Today, we journey back to June 1969 in Kimberley, British Columbia, where a routine errand turned into a nightmare for the Porter family. 16-year-old Philip Porter, the son of a prominent local figure and someone with an intellectual disability, vanished without a trace. Stay with me as we unravel the mystery of Philip's disappearance, the frantic search efforts, and the enduring impact on a close-knit community. What truly happened to Philip Porter? Let's dive in. Kimberley was once a small company town, nestled in the East Kootenays of British Columbia, with a population of about 7,000 people. Most of the residents worked at Cominco's iron and fertilizer plants or the nearby Sullivan mine, which was the largest lead-zinc mine in the world at the time.
This is the story about the old Sullivan mine, up near Kimberley, British Columbia, Canada. British Columbia is a land of rich resources. Mining, logging, and fishing for well over 100 years has been the bill payer of this province. The money spent on wages alone from various companies has kept thousands of families fed and paid billions into government coffers. And one of these big players was the Sullivan mine located west of the Rocky Mountains near the town of Kimberley. The Sullivan mine was discovered in 1892 by Pat Sullivan, who was one of the 4 prospectors who located this large deposit of minerals. After a few years of prospecting the deposit, they sold it in 1909 to the Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company of Canada. This company eventually became known as Teck Cominco. Teck Cominco developed the deposit, and this mine ran for 92 years. The mine was responsible for the town of Kimberley, where most miners lived with families. The mine saw many fathers and sons work as it provided stable employment for many years. Of course, when the mine first opened, all mining was done by hand. There was little in the way of mechanization. The mine had its own narrow gauge rail system underground going in various directions where ore would be put into mine carts. These carts were then transported along this rail system to one of 3 crushing chambers where the ore would be crushed and separated. There was over 5,000 feet of this railway underground. The mine had its own steel foundry on site where some of the ore was crushed into iron ore, which was then turned into steel. Other ores were transported to Trail, where there was another large smelter. At first, the mine could only produce about 50 tons of lead per day. By 1922, the mine developed the world's first differential froth flotation, which was a process that made the recovery of zinc economical. By 1949, the Sullivan mine had a milling capacity of 11,000 tons per day. In 2001, the mine officially closed when the ore ran out. Over that time, the mine produced ore containing over 17 million tons of zinc and lead and more than 285 million troy ounces of silver, which were together worth more than $20 billion at the time it closed. It is said that the mine produced enough zinc to supply the zinc content of over 160 million automobiles. People who were still young moved on, but many who were retired stayed living in Kimberley. The town is now a tourist destination of outdoor activities and skiing in the nearby Purcell mountain ranges. There is also an underground railroad for tourists now, too. I hope you enjoyed this short story about the old Sullivan mine in Kimberley, BC.
Robin Porter, a mining engineer originally from Saskatchewan, served as a superintendent of Cominco. In July 1969, he was preparing to move his family to Trail, where he would take on a prestigious role as head of a multi-million-dollar forwarding coal company, subsidiary of Canadian Pacific Railway and Cominco. His wife, Patricia Porter, was getting ready to take a short flight to Trail to join Robin and oversee the family's transition. Their youngest of 3 kids, 16-year-old Philip, who had intellectual disabilities, would join them in time to start the school year in September. Patricia planned to meet with Philip's school counselor the next day. A few days earlier, Philip had deposited all of his spare cash, around $38, in his savings account. He was excited to attend Scout camp in a couple of days, a highlight of his year. He had already confirmed with Scoutmaster Jack Martin that the camp would take place before the family's move to Trail, and his gear was laid out, ready in his room. It was the first day of school, holidays, just after 1 p.m. Patricia asked Philip to run some errands, pick up groceries, and collect her airline ticket from the travel agency. Though it was summer, the days was cold and rainy. Philip put on his green ski jacket, brown corduroy pants, and black Oxford shoes. Before leaving, he reassured his mother, "I won't be too long. I'm coming home to hang out with my friends." Philip, well known in the community, strolled down Gigaridge Road. He was familiar to residents, just like the smokestacks towering over the fertilizer plant. He collected the airline ticket and stopped at a SuperValu grocery store, where Joyce Bell remembers bagging 5 pounds of new potatoes, 2 loaves of bread, and some tomatoes for him. Afterward, he dropped off some mail at the Cominco office where his father worked. A Cominco accountant who knew Philip saw him heading up the trail toward home. A school friend and a city foreman also spotted Philip walking uphill with a large bag of groceries. It was around 2:30 p.m. at that time. However, Patricia's flight to Trail was canceled, and as the afternoon passed, the Porter household grew anxious. By 5 p.m., when Philip still had not returned for dinner, Patricia grew worried. Philip was responsible and rarely deviated from his routine without letting someone know. She called around to his friends, but no one had seen him. Growing more concerned, she contacted the police. By 7 p.m., George Williams, a neighbor and a family friend, had gone into town to search for Philip, but found no trace of him. He alerted the RCMP, who issued a missing persons alert and broadcast Philip's description on the radio. Patricia dialed the local RCMP station, her voice trembling as she reported Philip missing. Within moments, the town was buzzing with the urgency of the situation. A missing person bulletin blared from the radio, spreading the news like wildfire. Local volunteers, friends, and neighbors joined forces, scouring the woods, fields, and even the streets of townsite. By nightfall, 1,500 volunteers had turned out, their flashlights flickering through the trees. The air was thick with worry, and an intense sense of dread hung over Kimberly. As the search parties combed through every corner, the police mobilized an RCMP plane and a tracking dog, determined to find any sign of the boy. But as the sun rose on the following day, the search yielded no results, only a growing sense of despair. Amid the chaos, Patricia received a phone call that would change everything. A low, raspy voice on the line spoke deliberately, as if savoring each word. "I have your son," the voice said, chilling her to the bone. "I want $100,000 for his safe return." Patricia's mind raced. She recognized the threat, the ultimatum. Report to the police and her son would be lost forever. The man continued, his tone insistent yet oddly detached, as if he were reading from a script. "Trust us. No one will ever find him." And the line went dead, leaving Patricia in a suffocating silence. She felt her world fracture into pieces, each shard reflecting fear and desperation. Days passed, and no sign of Philip. The search efforts dwindled, yet hope flickered. On July 17th, 3 weeks after his disappearance, a letter arrived, ominously typed in capital letters on cheap paper. It was a ransom note, signed simply "The Syndicate." The message was blunt: "Boy alive, well, miss his mother, smarten up if you want him back alive. They went on to describe how they had warned her not to involve the police and instructed her to follow their demands exactly. Robin Porter, Philip's father, was thrust into a nightmare he never expected. He worked tirelessly, raising the demanded ransom amount while feeling helpless and desperate. Every moment was a strain on his family, the burden of fear profound in their home. A week later, the next letter arrived, detailing precisely where Robin was to leave the money. As he prepared to comply, the police had already set up a trap, staking out the designated drop-off site. They understood the urgency. They had to act fast, knowing that every moment was crucial. The tension was electric as Robin drove to the location, his heart pounding. Would this be the moment they found Philip? Would they finally put an end to the agony? He placed the money as instructed and waited, fear gnawing at him. Suddenly, officers swooped in, apprehending a 50-year-old man who had once worked at Cominco. The grip of hope tightened around Robin's heart, but it soon twisted into dread. There was still no sign of Philip. As the community rallied around the Porters, the search continued, but it felt increasingly futile. Investigators at the time employed every tool at their disposal: ground searches, wiretaps, polygraph tests, and undercover operations. They scoured mine shafts, sewer pipes, and properties in Wycliffe and along Moy Lake, seeking any evidence that might unravel the mystery of Philip's disappearance. If you want to get rid of someone, you throw them down a mine shaft, they would often say. Retired Sergeant Fred Bognarek recalled the exhaustive search. We went through every tunnel and shaft with cameras and probes. We wanted to leave no stone unturned. But the weeks turned into months, and hope began to fade. Earl Bennett was the name of the man that was arrested, charged with extortion, and eventually convicted. However, despite his conviction, he maintained he acted alone and never confessed to any of involvement in Philip's disappearance. He passed away in Panarctic Oil's Flight 416 plane crash in the Arctic Ocean, 2,500 kilometers north of Edmonton, working as an oil rig welder on October 30th, 1974, taking with him the secrets of that fateful day. Although many, including authorities, believed Earl Bennett was responsible for Philip Porter's disappearance, could it simply be a bizarre twist of fate that Bennett, a convicted extortionist and prime suspect in the kidnapping, was on a flight that crashed and took his life shortly after being released from prison for a lesser offense? Let's dig in to what really happened on that flight. The 4-engine Lockheed Electra Flight 416 crashed into the Arctic Ocean while attempting to land at the remote oil exploration outpost of Rhea Point, located in Canada's far north. This tragic event unfolded during the aircraft's descent into the region, where weather conditions and internal miscommunications contributed to its fatal crash. As Flight 416 approached Rhea Point, the pilots received reports about the weather conditions. Captain Thompson and his crew were preparing for their descent when they became distracted by a radio conversation with Leonard Storvold, the Pan-Arctic drilling superintendent. This conversation, which concerned the cargo the plane was carrying, grew tense, as Thompson seemed frustrated with the lack of operational details from the ground crew. This distraction continued as the aircraft began its descent, despite being in a critical phase of the flight. At around 2,000 feet, the flight crew initiated their approach procedure, which required them to descend in stages while following instrument readings since the runway was not yet visible. The aircraft was to descend to a minimum of 450 feet, an altitude known as the minimum descent altitude, MDA, before they could continue to land. However, Captain Thompson made a decision to reset his radio altimeter to alert at 300 feet by bypassing standard protocol, which would normally require them to level off at 450 feet if the runway remained out of sight. As they descended, further complications arose. First, Officer Hatton was monitoring the altitude calls, while Captain Thompson continued his conversation with Storvold, violating the sterile flight deck rule, which wasn't mandatory in 1974. At 550 feet, the aircraft was fully configured for landing, but as they approached 450 feet, it became apparent that the runway still wasn't visible. Despite this, Captain Thompson continued to descend, going against established guidelines. By 300 feet, the aircraft was still in a hazardous position, flying low over the Arctic Ocean without visual confirmation of the runway. Hatton, sensing the danger, began calling out instrument readings, urging the captain to stop the descent, but there was no response from Thompson. The situation worsened when the captain suddenly pitched the aircraft forward sharply, creating negative G-forces that lifted the crew from their seats. The descent rate increased dramatically, and despite desperate attempts by Hatton, flight engineer Wayman, to gain control, the aircraft crashed just under 2 nautical miles from the runway. The crash impact was devastating. The Lockheed Electra struck the sea ice with such force that it broke the fuselage in two. The flight deck was hurled across the ice while the rest of the plane broke apart and burned. Most of the fuselage, along with 3 engines, sank into the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean, taking several passengers with it. In the cabin, passengers experienced deceleration forces of up to 20 Gs, with many being thrown from their seats as the plane disintegrated. Of the 31 passengers and crew aboard, 15 died instantly upon impact. 6 others drowned as the wreckage was carried away by the sea, and 5 more succumbed to their injuries before any rescue efforts could reach them. 5 passengers managed to survive on the ice for a short time, but they eventually perished from exposure to the harsh Arctic conditions. The aftermath of the crash revealed serious flaws in the flight's decision-making processes, particularly the violation of standard procedures, poor communication, and distractions that led to the descent below the safe minimum altitude. These factors, compounded by the lack of visibility and weather-related challenges, culminated in one of the most tragic aviation accidents in the region's history. Investigators examined a litany of possible factors, from the operating culture at Panarctic Oils, to the visual conditions on the night of the crash, to the captain's health and personal life. In the end, consensus was difficult to find. Did the captain act irrationally due to complications of untreated liver disease per the autopsy reports? Was he misled by an illusion amid the darkness and blowing snow? Was he suddenly incapacitated by a seizure? Or was it simply an accumulation of small operational, psychological, and physiological stressors that all came together in a brief moment of madness? There isn't a clear answer, but there is a fascinating, forgotten story to be told along the way. Now, let's get back to the story and continue where we left off. Sergeant Chris Newell of the Kimberley RCMP emphasized that despite the passage of 5 decades, the case remains active. He stated that they were reaching out to the public for any information that could assist in bringing closure to the family. Despite various reported sightings over the years, none have yielded any conclusive leads. Philip's brother, Doug Porter, now 75, reflected on their time together, recalling the last memory he has of Philip, skiing and sharing lunch on the slope during Christmas of 1968. He noted that this was the last time he saw his brother, the pain of loss still palpable after all these years. Sergeant Fred Bognarek, who was the Kimberley detachment commander at the time and a friend of the Porter family, continues to be haunted by the investigation. He expressed that he still thinks about the case often and feels troubled by the lack of closure. 10 years ago, Bognarek shared his deep conviction that evidence pointed to Bennett as a key figure in Philip's disappearance. He recalled how Bennett, a neighbor, could not fully account for his whereabouts on the day Philip went missing. On July 1970, Bognarek says over a year after Philip had gone missing, they discovered that the Bennett's brother Ross had a farm several miles southeast of Kimberley, which Earl used as a getaway. It was also close to Wycliffe, the location of the initial money drop. The investigation revealed troubling details, such as an empty gasoline barrel and around the impression in the ground, where another gasoline barrel once stood. Very nearby was a cutaway top, part of a gasoline barrel, and alongside was a remnant of a 1/4-inch steel plate, seemingly cut to replace the cutaway lid of the mentioned barrel. An intensive search of all the Bennett farm failed to reveal any trace of this second gas barrel. In the manure pile where the horses were, they found a man's toque, blue in color. On close examination was noticed several strands of black, healthy hair. Bennett was not known to ever wear that toque. Furthermore, at this time, Bennett was generally bald all the time, and the hair had remained on Bennett's neck was grayish. Philip was known to wear a toque, and his hair was dark and healthy. Subsequently, the RCMP crime lab examined the hair and found it similar to samples of Philip. The search also turned up a partially burned gray-green blanket, about 1/3 of a meter below the surface of a refuse area on the farm. There are a number of stains on it that looked like blood. Irene Bennett, Earl's wife, later identified it looking similar to one that they had used for their dog in the car. Sergeant Tony Prokop from the crime detection lab examined 23 scalp hairs found in the toque and compared them to 26 hairs of Philip that Porter had provided. He also compared Philip's hairs with 2 scalp hairs found on the scrap of burned blanket and 43 human hairs found among particles of dust vacuum from Bennett's former truck, which was recovered from Burns Lake area. A neighbor of Bennett, 2 houses to the east, left on his holidays and asked Bennett to care for the property. Unfortunately, the police did not learn of this event until the month of August. A search was executed on this property and found a bag of decomposed fruit and vegetables proven to be quite similar to those that Mrs. Porter sent to Philip to buy at SuperValue. Prokop said that in his opinion, the hairs from the hat, the blanket, and the vacuum particles could have originated from the same source. Different people can have similar hair and hairs on the same head, and they can vary, he said. It was hardly inconclusive, and there were still many years to come before DNA would become part of the forensic toolkit. Bodnar stated that Philip had been positively identified climbing the stairs on his way home shortly before the noon hour, within a stairway located just across the street from the Bennett residence. He expressed a sense of regret and frustration, wishing he could blame someone else for the tragedy. In the late 1980s, years after retiring from the RCMP, Bodnar helped fund a team of divers from North Vancouver's Can Dives Construction to search the lake. Although they found nothing at the time, Bodnar believes that with modern technology, it might be possible to scan the lake bed and locate the gasoline barrel he suspects contains Philip's remains. However, he acknowledges that it would be like finding a golden needle in a haystack. After being interviewed by Global News in 2019 for the 50th anniversary of Philip's disappearance, Bodnar was contacted by a woman. She claimed that in 1969 her ex-husband had confessed to hitting Philip in a fatal hit-and-run accident. According to her, he had then hidden Philip's body in the foundation of a house under construction. Bodnar passed this information on to the Kimberley RCMP, but admits he's no longer in the loop and hasn't heard whether this lead was ever investigated or followed up. As the community of Kimberley remembers Philip Porter on his 50th anniversary, the Kimberley RCMP continue to seek any new leads or information. They urge anyone with knowledge of the case to come forward, inviting tips to be shared either through the Kimberley RCMP or Crime Stoppers. The disappearance of Philip Porter remains a haunting chapter in Kimberley's history, a story of love, loss, and the enduring quest for answers. For Philip's family, the hope for closure is as alive today as it was on that fateful June afternoon in 1969. Kimberley, once a town bound by the rhythm of the mind, now bore the scars of tragedy. The air was thick with questions that remained unanswered. Where was Philip? What had happened to the boy who went out for errands but never returned? As the seasons changed, so did the mood in Kimberley. The Porters were left to navigate a new reality, the specter of their son's disappearance hanging heavy in the air. The community was torn between hope and despair, grappling with the unanswered questions. Despite police efforts, Philip's fate remained a mystery, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the everyday facade of life. The memory of a bright young boy with laughter that echoed through the woods lingered in the hearts of those who knew him. As the story of Philip Porter faded into the annals of local lore, the search for truth continued, a haunting reminder of love, loss, and the enduring hope that one day answers would come. Thank you for joining us on this haunted journey through the story of Philip Porter. The echoes of this disappearance still resonate in the town of Kimberley, a stark reminder of how quickly life can change. As we've seen, the search for answers can be fraught with despair, yet it also highlights the resilience of a community bound by love and hope. While the mystery remains unsolved, the legacy of Philip's spirit endures, prompting us to reflect on the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing those we hold dear. Stay tuned, where we will continue to explore the untold stories and the mysteries that shape our world from time to time. Until next time, remember to keep your curiosity alive and your heart open. I'm Lino Farah. Take care and stay safe.